At her son Harry's wedding reception, Matilda Jacob heard her younger sister before she saw her. Mabel lifted a glass toward a sharply dressed man and laughed. "That's my sister," she announced loudly. "She's unemployed now. She's been living off the family for years." Nearby conversations stopped. Several guests turned to stare at Matilda. Someone lowered their fork without taking a bite. Matilda simply smiled and sipped her wine. She had practiced that smile for 3 long years. Nobody in that beautiful hall knew the truth. The man Mabel was trying so hard to impress had spent years searching for Matilda without success. Before the night ended, one quiet conversation would expose every lie Mabel had carefully built. Matilda Jacob was 46 years old. Standing quietly near the edge of a room had become normal for her. 3 years earlier, she had always been the woman everyone waited for before making important business decisions. She built successful companies without wealthy parents or powerful connections. Everything she owned came from discipline and hard work. Now she watched Harry laugh happily beside his new wife, Jane. That smile reminded her of her late mother. No guest at the wedding knew what Matilda had sacrificed. To them, she was simply Mabel's unemployed older sister. They saw a woman without a title. They never imagined she had once been one of the country's most respected business strategists, or that she had willingly walked away from everything she built. 3 years before the wedding, Matilda stood inside a glass conference room on the 40th floor of her company's headquarters. She was only days away from becoming managing partner when her phone rang. The caller was her mother. "Mom, is everything all right?" Matilda asked after stepping outside. Her mother's voice shook. "The doctors found cancer." Matilda felt her heart stop. "How serious?" she whispered. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," her mother replied quietly. The busy city below suddenly meant nothing. Minutes later, Matilda returned to the meeting room. Every partner looked at her, expecting good news. Instead, she calmly said, "I'm withdrawing my name. My family needs me more." 20 years of hard work disappeared with that single decision, and she never regretted making it. That evening Matilda called her younger sister. "Mabel," she said gently, "Mom can't live alone anymore. One of us has to stay with her." Mabel sighed before answering. "I can't leave my job, Matilda. I've worked too hard to get here. If I step away now, someone else will replace me." Matilda remained silent for several seconds because she understood exactly what Mabel feared. "All right," she finally replied. "I'll stay with Mom." Relief filled Mabel's voice immediately. "Thank you. I knew you'd understand." Matilda ended the call believing they had simply shared family responsibilities. She had no idea that one decision would slowly erase her reputation while allowing Mabel to become the family's success story. The next 2 years completely changed Matilda's life. Every morning began before sunrise with hospital visits, medication schedules, and doctor's appointments. She sold her apartment and moved into a smaller home to pay medical bills. Her business phone slowly became silent. Clients stopped calling. Colleagues moved on without her. One evening, while sitting beside the hospital bed, her mother held her hand tightly. "Listen to me," she whispered. "People will judge you by the room you're standing in. Never judge yourself the same way." Matilda smiled through her tears. "You're still teaching me." Her mother smiled weakly. "Because one day you'll need these words." Neither of them knew those would become the most valuable lesson Matilda would ever receive. Spring arrived, and Matilda buried her mother beneath gray skies. After the service, relatives gathered in the church hall, eating quietly and sharing memories. Then the conversation shifted. Aunt Lois patted Matilda's shoulder and sighed. "It's such a shame," she said. "You had such a wonderful career before all this happened." The word "before" stung. It sounded as though Matilda's life had already ended. Across the room, Mabel accepted hugs and sympathy from everyone. "I'm worried about Matilda," she told a cousin. "She's been out of work for years. I hope she finds her way again." Nobody corrected her. Nobody mentioned who had stayed beside their mother every single day. Standing alone with a casserole dish in her hands, Matilda realized something painful. The people who never shared her burden were now writing her story. The months after the funeral were filled with paperwork instead of tears. Insurance forms, hospital bills, legal documents, and endless signatures replaced hospital visits. One afternoon, Matilda's phone rang. It was Harry. "Mom," he said excitedly, "Jane and I are getting married." Joy filled her heart. "That's wonderful," she laughed. "I'm so happy for both of you." They spent nearly an hour discussing wedding plans before Harry became quiet. "Mom, can I ask you something?" She immediately knew it would be difficult. "Of course." He hesitated. "Aunt Mabel will be there. If she says anything, could you please ignore it? I just want one peaceful day." Matilda closed her eyes briefly. "Don't worry," she answered gently. "Your wedding belongs to you and Jane. I won't let anything spoil it." Before ending the call, Matilda asked one final question. "Harry, where are you working these days?" "Moonlight Strategy Group," he replied proudly. "Aunt Mabel helped me get the interview. She's been amazing." Matilda smiled to herself. "That's an excellent company." After hanging up, she remained seated in silence. Years earlier, Moonlight Strategy Group had been one of her biggest competitors. She had created a business decision system so effective that several consulting firms quietly adapted it. Somewhere along the way, Moonlight adopted a version of her work, and newer employees probably believed it had always belonged to the company. Mabel had spent years building her career using ideas inspired by her own sister without ever knowing it. The truth wasn't hidden because Matilda kept it secret. It stayed hidden because nobody ever cared enough to ask about her past. For several minutes, Matilda considered telling Harry everything. She could have shown him old newspaper articles, awards, and photographs from conferences where she had been the keynote speaker. Instead, she quietly placed those memories back into their box. "This weekend isn't about me," she whispered. "It's about my son." She no longer wanted to prove her value through old achievements. If people believed she had accomplished nothing, she would let them think so. Still, one question lingered in her heart. Did Mabel truly believe she had become worthless because she no longer had a title? Or had success simply changed the way her sister measured people? Matilda pushed the thought aside. She promised herself she would attend the wedding, celebrate Harry and Jane, smile politely, and leave without becoming anyone's conversation. Friday evening brought the rehearsal dinner at a beautiful vineyard restaurant. Jane's parents welcomed everyone warmly, and the atmosphere felt relaxed until Mabel arrived. She walked confidently through the room, greeting guests as though she owned the place. Within minutes she had gathered a crowd, sharing stories about important meetings and influential executives. "Our CEO, Mr. Robert Duke, expects nothing but excellence," she said proudly. "Last month I presented directly to him, and he loved my strategy." Everyone listened with admiration. Matilda quietly sat near the window with a glass of wine, watching without speaking. Years of leading boardrooms had taught her how to read people. Mabel wasn't simply telling stories. She was performing, hoping to impress someone who wasn't even there. Matilda had no idea that before the wedding ended, Mr. Robert Duke himself would change everything. Mr. Robert Duke never appeared at the rehearsal dinner, but his name dominated every conversation Mabel started. "He's the smartest CEO I've ever worked with," she said proudly. "He notices everything." She smiled each time she mentioned him, hoping someone would admire her connection to such an important man. Jane's father listened politely while Harry looked impressed. Matilda quietly enjoyed her meal without joining the discussion. She had never met Mr. Robert Duke because he became CEO after she left the consulting industry. Mabel assumed her sister would envy her success, but Matilda no longer measured life that way. She simply watched her son enjoying the evening and reminded herself why she had come. This weekend belonged to Harry and Jane, not to old careers or family rivalries. During dinner, Jane's mother smiled warmly at Matilda. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked kindly. Before Matilda could answer, Mabel laughed softly. "Oh, Matilda's between jobs," she said. "Actually, she's been between jobs for quite a while now." Several guests smiled awkwardly. Mabel continued speaking. She's taking things one day at a time. Matilda felt every eye settle on her. She calmly replied, "That's one way to describe it." Inside, however, she felt the familiar sting. 2 years of caring for a dying mother had been reduced to unemployment. She wanted to explain the truth but remembered the promise she had made to Harry. She smiled politely, changed the subject, and allowed the conversation to continue, even though her silence cost her more than anyone realized. After dinner, Matilda stepped onto the terrace overlooking the vineyard. The cool evening breeze helped settle her thoughts. A moment later Jane joined her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Jane said. "Not at all," Matilda answered with a smile. They stood quietly for a while before Jane asked, "Harry told me you cared for your mother until she passed away. How did you manage?" Matilda smiled sadly. "One day at a time." She shared stories about early hospital mornings, long nights, and simple conversations that became precious memories. Jane listened without interrupting. When Matilda finished, Jane gently said, "What you did wasn't a gap in your life. It was probably the most important work anyone could ever do." Matilda quickly looked toward the vineyard. After 3 years of being misunderstood, those few words almost brought her to tears. When they returned inside, Mabel was entertaining another group of guests with stories about business meetings. Jane quietly smiled at Matilda as they walked back to the table. During dessert, Jane's father casually mentioned that his company might eventually need strategic advice. "Nothing urgent," he said. "Just something I've been considering." Mabel reacted immediately. "I'd be delighted to help," she replied confidently. She reached into her handbag, removed a stack of elegant navy business cards, and spread them neatly across the table. "Here's my direct contact information," she said proudly. Then she slowly turned toward Matilda with a pleasant smile. "Matilda," she asked sweetly, "do you have a business card you'd like to give Mr. Collins too?" The question sounded polite, but everyone understood what she really meant. Silence settled over the table. Matilda hadn't carried business cards since leaving her career 3 years earlier. She looked at Mabel's cards lying proudly across the white tablecloth before quietly shaking her head. "No," she answered gently. "I don't have one anymore." Mabel smiled with quiet satisfaction and slipped her cards toward Jane's father. Moments later dessert arrived, and everyone resumed talking, but Matilda could not forget that small moment. Back home that night, she opened an old storage box hidden inside her closet. Instead of certificates or awards, she picked up a photograph of herself and her mother laughing after one of her business conferences years earlier. Holding the picture close, she whispered, "If people forget who I was, does that mean I stopped mattering?" She didn't know it yet, but the wedding reception would answer that question forever. On the morning of the wedding, Harry knocked gently on the small room where Matilda was getting ready. "Mom, can you help me with my tie?" he asked. She smiled. "You still can't do it yourself?" Harry laughed nervously. "Not when it matters." As she adjusted the knot, she noticed his hands shaking. "You'll be fine," she said. He looked at her through the mirror. "About what I asked you before. About Aunt Mabel. I'm sorry." Matilda rested a hand on his shoulder. "Don't apologize. Today is about you and Jane. I promised there would be peace, and I intend to keep that promise." Harry hugged her tightly. Neither of them knew someone else would soon create the very scene he feared. The ceremony was beautiful. Friends applauded as Harry and Jane exchanged vows beneath white flowers overlooking the vineyard. Afterward, everyone gathered inside the reception hall filled with music, laughter, and warm lights. Matilda had been seated near the back with distant relatives and a few of Jane's family friends. She didn't mind. From there, she could watch Harry enjoying the happiest day of his life. Across the room, Mabel moved confidently from table to table, greeting important guests and laughing loudly. Her attention kept returning to one distinguished man in a tailored gray suit. He carried himself with quiet confidence instead of flashy authority. Mabel stayed close to him all evening, refreshing his drink and smiling at everything he said. Matilda quietly wondered if this calm gentleman was the famous Mr. Robert Duke. As the evening continued, Matilda noticed Mabel leading Mr. Robert Duke toward the back of the reception hall. Her stomach tightened immediately. Years of reading boardrooms had taught her to recognize when someone was preparing a performance. Jane noticed the same thing from across the room and began walking toward them, but she was too far away. Harry remained near the dance floor greeting guests, completely unaware. Mabel wore the smile she always used before saying something she believed would impress others. Mr. Robert Duke followed politely, unaware he was about to become part of a family drama. Matilda quietly placed her wine glass on the table and straightened her shoulders. Old habits returned without effort. She suddenly felt like the executive she had once been. Mabel stopped beside Matilda's table and smiled brightly. "Mr. Duke," she announced, "I'd like you to meet my older sister, Matilda." Then she laughed lightly before adding, "She's the unemployed one I mentioned earlier. She's been living off the family for years now." Bless her heart. The words landed like stones. Nearby conversations stopped. Several guests turned toward Matilda. Harry looked over from across the room, sensing something was wrong. Matilda simply smiled. "She's right," she said quietly. "I don't have a title anymore." She meant it as acceptance, not defeat. Yet the moment the words left her mouth, something changed. For the first time in years, she realized a title had never been the reason she mattered. Mr. Robert Duke slowly placed his glass on the table and studied Matilda carefully. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "Would you repeat your name?" "Matilda Jacob," she answered calmly. Mabel quickly added, "Yes, my sister." Mr. Duke repeated the name quietly to himself before his eyes widened. "Matilda Jacob," he said slowly. "Are you the Matilda Jacob who created the decision mapping framework?" The nearby tables fell silent. Mabel's smile froze. Matilda nodded modestly. "I created an early version of it many years ago." Mr. Duke shook his head in disbelief. "Many years ago? Our entire strategy division still depends on your work today." For the first time that evening, every person in the room looked at Matilda with complete attention, and Mabel suddenly realized the story she had spent years telling was beginning to collapse. The room became so quiet that even the music seemed far away. Mr. Robert Duke smiled with genuine surprise. "For 3 years," he said, "my recruitment team searched for you. Every hiring season, I asked whether anyone had found Matilda Jacob." He shook his head slowly. "Then your name simply disappeared." Matilda smiled politely. "I wasn't hiding," she replied. "My mother became seriously ill. I left everything to care for her until she passed away." Mr. Duke lowered his head respectfully. "While we searched every major consulting firm, you were sitting beside your mother?" "Yes," Matilda answered. "That was where I was needed most." Around them, guests exchanged stunned looks. The woman they had quietly pitied had willingly walked away from one of the greatest careers in the industry. Mabel forced a nervous laugh. "Well, that was years ago," she said quickly. "The industry has changed. She's been away for a long time." She hoped the conversation would move on. Instead, Mr. Duke slowly turned toward her. His friendly smile disappeared. "Has it?" he asked calmly. "Because every major strategy meeting in my company still begins with principles your sister created." Mabel swallowed hard. I didn't realize." "No," Mr. Duke interrupted gently. "You clearly didn't." His voice remained calm, but everyone nearby heard every word. "You introduced the woman whose work shaped this company as an unemployed burden at her own son's wedding." Mabel's face turned pale. She searched for another excuse, but none came. For the first time in years, she had no words. Mr. Duke remained composed. "Mabel," he said quietly, "I've noticed the way you speak about people at work. I told myself it was ambition. Tonight I realized it is something else." He paused before continuing. "Character matters more than talent." Mabel's eyes filled with panic. "Mr. Duke, please." "I didn't mean—" He gently raised one hand. "This isn't the place for a discussion." He glanced around the wedding guests before adding, Our human resources department will contact you on Monday. What happens after that will follow company policy." The sentence was spoken without anger, yet it carried enormous weight. Harry stared at his aunt in disbelief. Jane quietly moved beside Matilda, placing a comforting hand on her arm. The reception hall remained silent as Mabel slowly sat down, unable to hide her shock. Matilda expected to feel victorious, but she didn't. Looking at her sister's broken expression, she felt sadness instead of revenge. Years of jealousy had finally caught up with Mabel, yet the moment brought no satisfaction. Jane whispered softly, "Are you all right?" Matilda nodded. "I'm fine." Harry walked over, looking confused. "Mom, what's happening?" She smiled gently. "Nothing you need to worry about today." She refused to let his wedding become a battlefield. Across the room, guests quietly returned to their conversations, but everyone kept glancing toward the family table. One conversation had changed the entire evening. Mabel stared at the floor, realizing that the image she had carefully built over many years had disappeared in less than 5 minutes. A few minutes later, Matilda quietly approached Mr. Robert Duke near the garden entrance. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," he replied. She looked him directly in the eye. "Please don't make any decision about my sister because of me." Mr. Duke looked surprised. "If she violated your company's values, that's your responsibility," Matilda continued. "But I don't want anyone thinking I asked for revenge. That's not who I am." Mr. Duke studied her for several seconds before smiling warmly. "Mrs. Jacob," he said, "I've spent 3 years searching for the right leader. After speaking with you for only a few minutes, I finally understand why." Matilda smiled politely, unaware that his next offer would change the direction of her life forever. Mr. Robert Duke folded his hands and smiled. "Matilda, I'd like you to come to Moonlight Strategy Group." She looked at him quietly. "I'm not talking about a consulting contract," he continued. "I want you to lead our entire strategy division." Matilda blinked in surprise. "You've never even worked with me," she said. Mr. Duke smiled. "I've worked with your ideas for years. My company has benefited from your thinking every single day." He paused before adding, "I've also just watched how you handled humiliation with grace. Skills build companies. Character protects them." Matilda looked toward Harry and Jane dancing together. She had never expected the happiest day of her son's life to become the day her own future changed. Mr. Duke reached into his jacket and handed Matilda a thick business card. "Call me on Monday," he said. "The position is yours if you want it." The salary he mentioned was more than she had earned before leaving her career. For a brief moment, Matilda imagined returning to boardrooms, leading executives, and rebuilding the reputation she had lost. The offer was everything she had once dreamed about. It would silence every person who had called her unemployed. It would prove Mabel wrong in front of everyone. She held the card gently between her fingers. For 3 years she had believed this was exactly what she wanted. Yet something inside her had quietly changed during those years beside her mother's hospital bed. Matilda looked down at the business card for a long moment. Then she smiled and slowly handed it back. Mr. Duke looked surprised. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "but I can't accept." He frowned slightly. "May I ask why?" Matilda nodded. "Because for years I believed my value came from my title. When I left my career, I thought I had lost myself. I was wrong." She smiled peacefully. "Taking care of my mother taught me something no boardroom ever could. My worth isn't printed on a business card." Mr. Duke remained silent, listening carefully. Around them, the wedding continued, but neither of them noticed. They were discussing something much bigger than a job. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life chasing someone else's company," Matilda continued. "I want to build something that reflects who I have become." Mr. Duke slowly smiled. "Most people would accept this offer immediately," he admitted. "Very few would walk away." Matilda laughed softly. 3 years ago, I would have accepted before you finished speaking." He nodded with respect. Then perhaps you've become a better leader than you were before. He extended his hand. If you ever build your own firm, I hope you'll let Moonlight Strategy Group become your first client. Matilda shook his hand warmly. That, she replied, is an offer I'll gladly accept. For the first time in years, she felt completely free. When Matilda returned to the reception hall, Harry hurried toward her. "Mom," he asked quietly, "are you okay?" She smiled and hugged him tightly. "I've never been better." Jane joined them with tears in her eyes. "You deserve every good thing that's coming," she whispered. Across the room, Mabel sat alone staring at the empty table where her business cards had once been displayed so proudly. She looked smaller than Matilda had ever seen her. Matilda met her sister's eyes for a brief moment. She didn't smile in victory or glare in anger. She simply nodded once before turning back to Harry and Jane. That small gesture closed a chapter neither sister had expected would end at a wedding reception. The next chapter would begin with forgiveness, difficult choices, and a future none of them could yet imagine. The reception slowly returned to normal. Music filled the hall again, and guests returned to the dance floor, but the conversation at every table was the same. People whispered about Matilda, not with pity anymore, but with admiration. Aunt Lois quietly walked over, her eyes filled with regret. "Matilda," she said softly, "I'm sorry. I judged you without knowing the whole story." Matilda smiled kindly. "You weren't the only one." Aunt Lois lowered her head. "I should have asked where you'd been instead of assuming why." Matilda squeezed her hand gently. "It's never too late to see someone clearly." Aunt Lois nodded, holding back tears. For the first time since her mother's funeral, someone in the family had chosen understanding instead of assumptions. Later that evening, Mabel slowly approached Matilda outside the reception hall. The confidence that usually filled her voice was gone. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. Matilda nodded. They stood beneath the vineyard lights in silence before Mabel finally spoke. "I don't know when I started competing with you," she admitted. "Maybe I've been doing it my whole life." She wiped away a tear. "Every time people praised you, I felt invisible. When you left your career, I convinced myself I'd finally caught up." Matilda listened without interrupting. "I'm not asking you to excuse what I did," Mabel continued. "I just wanted you to know the truth." It was the first honest conversation the sisters had shared in many years. Matilda looked at her younger sister for a long moment. "I always believed we were walking different paths," she said quietly. "I never knew you thought we were running the same race." Mabel lowered her eyes. "I spent years trying to prove I mattered." Matilda sighed. "So did I." Both sisters laughed softly through their tears. "The difference," Matilda continued, "is that I finally learned I didn't need anyone else's approval." Mabel nodded slowly. "I'm still trying to learn that." Matilda didn't pretend everything had been repaired. Too much pain stood between them. But she no longer carried anger. She simply hoped Mabel would someday stop measuring herself against other people and start measuring herself by the person she chose to become. On Monday morning, Mr. Robert Duke kept his promise. Instead of pressuring Matilda to join Moonlight Strategy Group, he called with another proposal. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. "If you're serious about starting your own consulting company, Moonlight would like to become your first client." Matilda smiled. "You mean that?" "Absolutely," he replied. "Great leaders don't always need jobs. Sometimes they need partners." They spent the next hour discussing ideas instead of job titles. By the end of the call, Matilda had agreed to launch her own consulting firm. For the first time in years, she wasn't rebuilding her old life. She was creating an entirely new one, built on values she had discovered beside her mother's hospital bed. 6 months passed quickly. Matilda opened Jacob Strategic Advisors with only 3 employees and a handful of carefully chosen clients. She refused to build a giant company. Instead, she built one where kindness mattered as much as talent. Moonlight Strategy Group became her first client, just as Mr. Robert Duke had promised. Harry and Jane often visited on weekends, bringing laughter back into the quiet house. One evening, Harry looked around his mother's modest office and smiled. "Mom," he said, "this place feels different from every company I've worked in." Matilda smiled back. "Because no one here is valued only for what they produce." Harry nodded thoughtfully. At that moment, he finally understood the lesson his mother had spent 3 years learning the hard way. One afternoon, Matilda interviewed a woman named Olivia for a strategy position. Her resume showed a 3-year employment gap. As soon as the interview began, Olivia looked nervous. "I know the gap looks bad," she said quickly. "I was caring for my father after his stroke." She lowered her eyes, expecting the interview to end there. Instead, Matilda smiled warmly. "Tell me about your father," she said. Olivia looked surprised before slowly sharing stories of hospital visits, sleepless nights, and learning patience through hardship. By the time she finished, tears filled her eyes. Matilda didn't ask about the gap again. She already knew everything she needed to know. "Welcome to Jacob's Strategic Advisors," she said. "We don't measure people by what they paused. We measure them by what they carried." Not long afterward, Harry and Jane visited Matilda for Sunday dinner with exciting news. Jane smiled as she placed a small gift box in front of her mother-in-law. "Open it," she said. Inside was a tiny pair of baby shoes. Matilda looked up in surprise. "You're going to be a grandmother," Harry laughed. Tears immediately filled her eyes. She hugged them both tightly. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she whispered. Later that evening, Harry sat beside his mother on the porch. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I believed the stories instead of asking you what really happened." Matilda smiled gently. "You asked when you were ready, and that's enough for me." Their relationship felt stronger than it had in years. Mabel eventually found another position at a smaller consulting firm in a different city. Before leaving, she visited Matilda one final time. "I don't expect us to become close again overnight," she admitted. "I know I broke your trust." Matilda nodded honestly. "Some wounds heal slowly." Mabel looked around the office. "You've built something beautiful." Matilda smiled. "Not just a business. A different way of living." Mabel laughed softly. "I'm still learning that success isn't everything." As she turned to leave, she stopped at the door. "Thank you for not destroying me when you had the chance." Matilda replied quietly, "Revenge would never have healed either of us." Mabel nodded before walking away, carrying lessons she wished she had learned much earlier. Months later, Jacob's Strategic Advisors continued to grow steadily. The company remained small by choice, serving clients who valued honesty as much as results. Mr. Robert Duke often recommended Matilda to other business leaders, keeping his promise without asking for anything in return. One afternoon, Matilda found the old photograph of herself and her mother tucked inside a desk drawer. She smiled as she remembered the words spoken beside that hospital bed. "People will judge you by the room you're standing in. Never judge yourself the same way." Looking around her office, Matilda realized she no longer needed anyone else's approval. She had finally become the woman her mother always believed she could be. The greatest success of her life had never been a title. It had been learning her own worth. A year after Harry's wedding, family and friends gathered once again, this time to celebrate the birth of Harry and Jane's daughter. As Matilda held her granddaughter in her arms, she looked around the room filled with laughter and quiet joy. No one talked about careers or salaries. No one asked who held the highest position or earned the most money. They simply celebrated being together. Matilda smiled, remembering how one wedding reception had completely changed her life. She had walked into that hall believing the world had forgotten her. She walked out knowing she never needed the world's permission to matter. Her greatest achievement was never the companies she built or the strategies she created. It was choosing love over ambition when her mother needed her most, and discovering that true success is measured not by titles, but by the lives we change when no one is watching. Kindly subscribe to Abbey Wealth Folktales.